Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parsha's Matot-Masei, and we will be discussing a part of Parsha's Matos. It's double Parsha this week, Matos and Masei. We'll be discussing a subject in Parsha's Matos. So in Parsha's Matos, we read how the tribes of Reuven and Gad, who had lots of cattle, lots of livestock, wanted, instead of going to enter the land of Israel proper, wanted to remain on the others on the eastern side of the Jordan River, which were the lands that the Jewish people had conquered from the Amorite kings Sihon and Og. And they requested this because it was a land that was very good for grazing cattle. And when Moshe first heard their request, he became very upset with them because he was afraid that if there would be tribes that would be saying we don't want to enter the land of Israel, that would actually scare up the Jewish people from entering the land of Israel, and we'd have a repeat of what happened by the sin of the spies, where the Jewish people didn't want to go into the land of Israel. And the response to Moshe from the tribes of Reuven and Gad was that we're not going to abandon the Jewish people. We will take this land, but we will still go and fight together with our brethren to conquer the land of Israel. They also said the following: Vayikshu Ela Vayomru, and they approached him and they said, Gidros Tzoi Nivdel Meknenu Pai, enclosures for the flock we will build for our cattle here. And cities for our children. We shall arm ourselves before the children of Israel until we bring them to their place. Our children shall dwell in the fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until the Jewish people take their inheritance. We shall not inherit with them from the Jordan and further. For our portion has come here on the eastern side of the Jordan. So Moshe was concerned that they would scare the Jewish people from entering the land of Israel. And they said, no, we will settle our livestock and family here on this eastern side of the Jordan, but we will go and fight and conquer the land of Israel and not return to our homes until the land has been divided up amongst the Jewish people. And Moshe says to them, if you do this, then you can have this part of the land. And Moshe says, build for yourselves cities for your children and enclosures for your sheep. And that which comes out from your mouth you shall do. Meaning you have to keep this part of the deal. If you keep this part of the deal, then you can have this part, you can have this land. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to keep it. So that is, the summary of the end of the Parsha. And actually the Parsha continues. The Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven actually go and further conquer the land on the eastern side of the Jordan to settle themselves into this area. Now, when they first approach Moshe, and they say after Moshe is concerned that if they don't go into the land of Israel, that will scare the rest of the Jewish people. So they approached Moshe, and the first thing they said was, basically, we're going to settle our cattle and families here, and we're going to go fight with the Jewish people for the land of Israel. And the wording they use is, Vayomru, and they said, Gidros Tzai Nivdel Meknenu Pai, enclosures for the sheep we shall build for our cattle here, and cities for our children. So Rashi makes the following comment on the words, we shall build enclosures for the sheep we shall build for our cattle. They were more concerned with their property, meaning their animals, than with their sons and daughters. Shikdimu mikneyam latapam. Because when they approached Moshe, what did they say first? They said, we will build the enclosures for our sheep, for our cattle, and cities for our children. They mentioned the cattle before the children. That means that they were more concerned with the cattle than with the children. Rashi continues, Amar lahem Moshe loikei. Not the way you're saying. Moshe said to them, not so. Asua ikar tafel. Make what's right. Make the main thing, and the secondary thing, the secondary thing. Get your priorities straight. Build for yourselves first cities for your children, and then enclosures for your sheep. And that's what Moshe says. When Moshe responds to them, to what they say, this is in Pasuk Chavdalid, build for yourselves cities for your children and enclosures for your sheep. That's for Moshe. They said sheep before children. Moshe says children before sheep. To point out to them that you have to have your priorities straight. The main thing are your children, not your money. Now, it would seem, I've always understood this, Rashi, that, did they really care about did they really care about their cattle more than their children? I don't think we have to say that. Probably not. I mean, why? Who would be that way? Just that if when you're talking, you mention the cattle before the children, then that's kind of I have to call it a Freudian slip, but it's a certain kind of, you express yourself in a certain way. When you talk, certain ways that you talk reveals what's really going on inside of you. So by mentioning the cattle before the children, then that means that in some way they were more concerned about the cattle of the children, because look, as they talked, they mentioned the cattle before the children. It could have been subconscious, and it just came out. But if you mention, but if this is the way you talk, that you mention the cattle before your children, then it must be that in some way you're caring about your cattle more than your children. Because if you really cared, of course, you mentioned your children first. That would be the way that I think typically we would learn this Rashi. The commentary of Ber Yosef suggests a different approach. And he actually starts with an approach that suggests that when the Jewish people mentioned the cattle before the children, it wasn't just, some kind of a slip. It wasn't just something that came out that reveals, what's really going on in your mind. They intentionally said that. They intentionally said the cattle before the children. But not necessarily because they're more important. Why would most people would never say their cows are more important than their children? You have these two tribes of Israel. We wouldn't say that about them. They intentionally said the cattle before the children, and of course there was a reason for it. At the same time, there is still something going on that shows us that at some level they cared about the cattle more than the children. Now let's see his approach. So he starts with the following. As I mentioned before, the area that the tribes of Reuben and Gad wanted to take as their inheritance, which was the area where the Jewish people were now encamped, was in the area east of the Jordan that used to be part of the kingdoms of Sichon and Og. Very, very strong, mighty kings that the Jewish people miraculously defeated. Now, in Bamidbar Chav Chav Gimel, chapter 21, verse 23, that talks about the battle with Sichon. First, the Jewish people actually just asked Sichon to pass through. Sichon didn't let, and he actually gathered his people for war. So the pasuk reads like this: Sichon not allow the Jewish people to pass through his border. Sichon gathers an entire nation, and he went out he went towards the Jewish people in the desert. He came to Yatz, and and he waged war against Israel. Now Rashi there makes the following comment. And Rashi's comment is based on the fact that it says that Sichem gathered all his people. I mean all his people. Gathered his army. What does all his people mean? So Rashi there, aside from the Medrash, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, Mani matriach al banai kol zayis litzrar al kol ir v'ir. The Jewish people were destined to take over this land. Normal circumstances would mean that they'd have to go lay siege from city to city and conquer each city. Hashem says, why do I have to bother my children to have to go through all that? He put in the heart that everybody is going to leave the city. Basically, all the men abandoned the city. Everybody went ahead and came to this war. All the able-bodied men, not the children, but all the able-bodied men went out to fight this war. You know, they hated the Jews so much, everybody decided they're going to go ahead and be part of this battle that's going to wipe out the Jewish people. They all wanted a chance to participate in it. But at the end of the day, they all came to one place. They were all slaughtered. They were all destroyed. And therefore, and what happened then? Now the Jewish people went to take over the cities. It was a cakewalk. There's nothing to battle for. There's only the women and the children. They just walked in and took it over. And the Medrash says the same thing happened later on in the war with Og. There also it says that the king of Og, the king of Bashan, went out towards them, he and all his nation for war. There too, all the men came out. They were all there together in one place, and they were all destroyed on the spot. Okay, that comes out therefore, says the Rebbe Yosef, that all the cities that were conquered were all intact. The Jewish people basically had houses, or the children of Gad and Reuben, if they wanted to, whoever wanted to go there, really now had a chance just to go ahead and settle into the houses. The cities weren't ravaged, they weren't destroyed, they were all intact. There was places for everyone to live. And therefore, when the tribes of Gad and Reuben wanted to tell Moshe that we'll settle our families here and we'll go fight with the Jewish people, the bigger job was dealing with creating the enclosures, the pens for their livestock. They had a tremendous amount of animals. The areas that they were now taking over didn't have the infrastructure for all the animals. That was going to be a job they had to build. But where their families are going to live while they're gone, look, we've got houses ready. They're going to go ahead and they can move in. Now, true, there's going to be a certain amount of, building that has to be done. The houses may have to be in some way redone for the families to live in there. The Amorites maybe only had 2 children, and the Jewish people had 8 children. The Amorites only had 1 sink. The Jewish people need 2 sinks. There had to be a certain amount of, building, refurbishing, renovating a little bit in order to accommodate the Jewish people living there. But they didn't have to go ahead and really do much in comparison to what they had the infrastructure they had to build for their animals. This was much smaller. So when the Jewish people said to Moshe, we are going to build the enclosures for our livestock and then talk about the children, they were saying that because they were basically talking about the big job and the small job. They mentioned the big job first. The big job was going to be to build the structures for their animals, and for their families, there was much less work. So they had a reason as to why they mentioned the cattle first, because what they needed to for the cattle was a much bigger job, and therefore it was mentioned first. That would be a very normal, natural thing to do. And therefore, there's no intentions to put the livestock for the children because the children are less important. They were just talking about practical. We have to do this first and this. This is the bigger job. This is the smaller job. Just a way of expressing which job is bigger. Okay. Nonetheless, as pointed out by our sages, and as pointed out by Moshe when he turned the order around, when he told them, build cities for your children and enclosures for your livestock. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was telling them, you're still making a mistake. You're making a big mistake, actually. And that is that you think it's okay for your families just to pretty much move right in to the cities that are intact. But the problem is, said Moshe, that all these cities were all connected in some way to the idol worship of the Amorites. We actually find that later on, when the tribe of Reuven takes over certain areas, it says, this is in chapter 30, Perek Lamed Beis, Pasuk Lamed Ches, chapter 32, verse 38. Ve'es Navoi ve'es Baal Ma'oin Musa Boishein. That when Reuven was building cities, was taking over and building cities, they were the cities of Nevo and Baal Ma'on, Musa Boishein, which means with changed names. Ve'esivma and Sivma. And they gave names for the cities that they built. So Rashi comments on, it says the cities were Nevo and Baal Ma'on with changed names. Nevo Baal Ma'on Shmos Avodah Zarahim. Those were names of idols. Those cities were named after the idols they worshipped. The Amorites called the cities by the name of the pagan gods they worshipped. Bnei Reuven changed the names to other names. And that's what it means, Musa B'Shem, with changed names. So it's very clear that the Amorites themselves, the names they give, all related to the Avodah Zarah, to the idol worship, And I'm going to add this part, and it could have very well also been that the homes were built in such a way that even represented their idol worship in some way. So Moshe is saying to the Bnei Gad, to the tribes of Reuven and Gad, you think your children are going to move into these cities and these homes that all have names after idols and idol worship, and you think that's okay? Add to the fact that they weren't even going to be there. For 14 years, they were away. And you're leaving your children in this environment that has all these idol worship names and all these idol worship influences. You can't do that. You think that they can just move in and we'll just, renovate a little bit. No, you have to rebuild. You have to take this all down. You've got to start anew. You can't just take over what the Amorites did. You can't expose your children to all that idol worship influence. You have to start all over again. You got to rebuild the whole thing. And that's what Moshe said when he said, build cities for your children. You have to do a rebuild. You can't just go ahead and use what was there. If you're going to settle here and leave your children here, you cannot allow them to live where all this idol worship influence is. You've got to knock it all down. You got to start it all over. You got to rebuild it anew. You got to build it with a Yiddish time. You got to build it with a Jewish flavor, with a spirit, with an environment that'll be there for serving Hashem and studying Torah. So Moshe Rabbeinu's point to them was that there's making a mistake. To think that you can just move in as is pretty much. No, you can't. You can't allow your children to be influenced from that. Because everything here relates to idol worship. And therefore, Moshe says, build cities for your children. Not just put the stress on your children. You have to now, you have a bigger job, or as big a job. It's not just about, you need new infrastructure for your cattle because until now there wasn't enough. You need to rebuild the whole area. That's as physically a big job. It's an involved job, and maybe even more involved job than what has to be built for the animals. But it's a big job, and it's the more important job. That's how the Ber Yosef says that was the discussion here. The Jewish people, the tribes of Gad and Reuben thought were just their minds. The bigger job was going to be to build what their animals need, because their families can pretty much just move in. And Moshe says, no, you can't do that. Everything about these cities revolves around idol worship, revolves around all the pagan gods that they worshipped. And you can't leave your children there like that. You have to rebuild the whole thing. And that's what they did. as we said before, from those examples of those cities. They built the cities, they rebuilt the cities, changed the names. No more Avodah Zarah names. Now, so that was a discussion between Moshe and the tribes of Reuben and Gad about the order of things. But Rashi says that what the tribes of Reuben and Gad did or said was a result of caring more about the money. What that means is that how did they make this mistake? How did they make this mistake to think that all they need to do for their children is just go for they need to do more work for the sheep than they need to go ahead and do for the children? How do they make this mistake to think they could just have the children move in and not be concerned about these influences? The answer is because they were more focused. They were too focused on the cattle. That was what this all was about. That's how it starts. The whole idea of staying in this part of the land was for the cattle. So their focus was the cattle. And since their focus was the cattle, that took the focus away from the children and caused this mistake to think our children can just go and move in. If you're too focused on your material, on materialism, you're not going to be thinking, you're not going to be sensitive enough to the spiritual needs. That's just the way it is. By being too focused on the materialistic side of things, they weren't focused enough on the ruchnius, on the spiritual side. And that's how they made this mistake to think they could have the children just go in and just live in the cities that were there. So it's not about how do you mention the animals before the children. There was a reason why they mentioned the animals before the children, because they thought the bigger job was what they needed to for the animals, and the children, we don't have to do that much. That mistake came about because they were too focused on their material needs. And Moshe pointed out to them, no, you're making a mistake. You don't have your priorities straight. Make what's main. That means be concerned about your children's spiritual welfare. And therefore, you actually have a bigger job to do. You have to rebuild the cities so that there'll be no negative influence on your children. That is how the Ber Yosef explains the back and forth here. It's a fascinating approach. It carries a very, very important lesson. And that lesson is that there are times that because we're too focused on our needs, we actually will compromise in some way on the environment that we create for our children. There are things that we may bring into our homes or allow in our homes because it serves our interests in some way or another. You know, the adults have a certain interest that they have, and because of that, they allow certain things in their home, not realizing that once those things are in the house, it's very hard that it won't have an influence on the children, whether it be the kind of literature that comes into the house, whether it be what's viewed on the internet, what kind of access is there in the house to the internet. You know, the adults have their reasons why they may be doing things, but they're not necessarily real, but they're forgetting what kind of potential danger this can create for their children. They don't love their children. Of course they love their children. Their children are the most important thing to them. But when you get too focused on your need, you can forget about more important things. If you get too focused on yourself, you forget about others, and you can even forget about your children. The same way the tribes of Gad and Reuven were so focused on their material needs they were so focused on the sheep, on the cattle, that therefore they didn't pay attention, didn't think about the effects that things could have on their children. That could happen to us also. We're too focused on our needs. We forget about what kind of negative influence it could have on our children. So it's a very, very important idea. How important it is that we always remain focused and sensitive to the environment that we allow our families to be exposed to, the environment that we allow in our homes, the environment that we that we take our family into, to make sure that we're not overly focused on ourselves and therefore forgetting about the spiritual welfare of our families. Okay, have a wonderful evening.